My name is Alara Ashworth, and I am 23 years old. For the last 6 months of my life, I have been a ghost, haunting the very halls I was raised in. But it was only after my family left me for dead, and a Scottish barbarian bought my ancestral home, that I truly learned what it meant to live. I never expected that the moment my family chose to abandon me in our darkest hour would be the beginning of my salvation, a salvation that came in the form of a man the world called uncivilized, but who showed me the only true civility I had ever known. Before I dive into the story of how I became a phantom in my own home and found my life in the process, I want to welcome all of you here today. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated by the very people who were supposed to support you, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe to join this incredible community of people who understand that sometimes the family you choose is more important than the one you are born into. The end of my world began not with a bang, but with the silent, creeping dread of a cold winter morning. The air in Blackwood Manor, a place that had housed 10 generations of my family, had grown thin and brittle with unspoken fear for months. Creditors, once polite and deferential, had become vultures circling a dying beast. My father, Lord Ashworth, a man whose spine was made of little more than wishful thinking, had long since retreated into a bottle of brandy, leaving the household to be tyrannized by my stepmother Isolde. She, in turn, funneled what little money we had left to her own feckless son, Gideon, a man whose only ambition was to empty the dregs of our family's coffers into his own frivolous pursuits. I was a relic of my father's first marriage, a ghost in their new reality long before I chose to become one literally. My mother had loved this house, every stone and secret passage, and she had passed that love on to me before she passed from this world. To my father and his new family, I was just another fixture, easily ignored, like a faded portrait or a chipped piece of china. That final morning, the silence was different. It wasn't the usual tense quiet of a household holding its breath. It was the hollow, echoing silence of absence. I walked from my chilly room, down the grand, curving staircase, my hand trailing over the familiar, smooth oak. No servants bustled, no scent of breakfast came from the kitchens. There was only dust motes dancing in the pale sunlight slanting through the tall, mullioned windows. In the dining hall, a single piece of parchment lay on the vast, polished table. My name was scrawled on it in Isolde's sharp, angry script. It was not a letter, it was a decree. They were gone, fled in the dead of night to the continent, escaping the debts that were finally closing in. The note was brief and colder than the winter air. It said the house was being sold to cover the worst of the debts, and that I, being of age, was to make my own way in the world. There was no farewell, no word of regret, only a final, cutting sentence: do not attempt to find us. You have always been a burden we could ill afford. A strange calm washed over me. The grief and panic I should have felt were distant, muffled by a lifetime of being made to feel like an inconvenience. I had been a burden, a quiet, unobtrusive burden, but a burden nonetheless. I looked around the magnificent hall, at the portraits of my ancestors, judging me from their gilded frames. This was my home, the only one I had ever known. They had abandoned it, they had abandoned me. But the house remained, a seed of defiance, small and hard, planted itself in my heart. They wanted me to disappear, to be cast out and forgotten. But what if I simply didn't leave? What if I became part of the house they had so carelessly discarded? I knew its secrets better than anyone. I knew the hidden priest holes from centuries past, the forgotten servants' corridors that snaked behind the walls, the dumbwaiter system that connected the kitchens to the upper floors, the larder in the old cellar that was always stocked with preserves and dried goods for emergencies. I could survive here. I would become the ghost of Blackwood Manor. The first few weeks were a lesson in absolute solitude. The remaining staff, unpaid for months, had already departed, taking what they could. The silence was my constant companion, broken only by the groan of old timbers and the sighing of the wind through the eaves. I learned to move like a whisper, my worn slippers making no sound on the floorboards I knew would not creak. I rationed the food from the cellar larder, my meals consisting of pickled vegetables, cured meats, and stale biscuits. I moved my bedding into a small forgotten room off the library, a space once used for storing old maps, its entrance concealed behind a heavy tapestry. It was windowless and safe. During the day, I would read from the vast library, devouring books I'd never had time for, my only light coming from a smuggled candle stub. At night, I would walk the halls, a true specter in a gray wool dress, my hand tracing the patterns on the wallpaper, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The house was cold, its heart having stopped beating when the fires went out, but I learned to wear layers and huddle under piles of old blankets. I felt a strange sense of ownership I had never experienced when my family was here. Before, I was merely a resident. Now, I was its keeper, its secret soul. I dusted the furniture in the main rooms, polished the silver with my own breath and the sleeve of my dress, and kept the library from succumbing to dust. It was a pointless, absurd act of defiance, but it was mine. I was preserving the memory of what Blackwood had been, not for the family that had betrayed it, but for the house itself. I lost track of time. Days blurred into a routine of survival and silent stewardship. I grew thinner, my face pale, and my eyes large in the dim light. I talked to the portraits, telling them stories, assuring them I would not let their home fall into ruin. Loneliness was a physical ache, a constant pressure in my chest, but the alternative, the shame of appearing in the local village, a destitute noblewoman cast out by her own family, was far worse. Here, in the shadows, I had a strange kind of freedom. The arrival of the lawyers was the first intrusion from the outside world. I watched them through a peephole in a second-floor gallery, their voices sharp and businesslike as they assessed the property. They spoke of the new owner, a Scot, a man of new money and no breeding. A Laird MacLeod, they called him, the name sounding foreign and harsh in the refined English air of the manor. They said he had bought it for a song, sight unseen, likely as a vulgar display of wealth. My heart sank. A barbarian would not appreciate the delicate history of Blackwood. He would likely gut it, paint over the murals, tear down the tapestries. The thought filled me with a cold, protective fury. This was my house now, mine to protect. Weeks later, the first of his people arrived. A small army of them, it seemed. Men with broad shoulders and rough, calloused hands, their voices a rolling burr of Gaelic that echoed strangely in the halls. They were not servants in the English sense. They moved with a casual authority, their loyalty clearly to their laird and not to the house itself. They opened windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight that sent me scurrying back to the shadows. They lit fires in the great hearths, and the house began to breathe again. The warmth was a welcome luxury, but it also made my hiding more precarious. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread filled the kitchens, a torturous temptation. My own supplies were dwindling. I had to become bolder. I began my nightly raids. Using the servants' passages, I could access the kitchens and pantries without being seen. I took only what would not be immediately missed: a heel of bread, a wedge of cheese, a few apples. I was a mouse in the walls, a creature of the night. But these men were not the complacent, half-asleep servants I remembered. They were sharp, observant. I heard them talking. Dougal, a grim-faced man with a thick gray beard who seemed to be the laird's second in command, spoke of a cold spot in the library. Another, a young lad named Finn, swore he saw a shadow move in the upper gallery where no shadow should be. They started leaving out charms, little bundles of herbs and salt, to ward off spirits. They called me the Baintiherna Ban, the White Lady of Blackwood. The name amused me. I was no lady, not anymore. I was a survivor. Then, he arrived. The Laird, Lachlan MacLeod. I watched his arrival from my perch in the map room, peering through a slit in the tapestry. He was not what I had expected. The lawyers had made him sound like an ogre. He was immense, taller and broader than any man I had ever seen. His hair was the color of dark copper, long and unbound, and his beard was thick and wild. He wore not the fine clothes of an English gentleman, but a heavy wool tunic, leather breeches, and scuffed boots. He looked like he had just stepped out of a Highland myth. He strode into the entrance hall, his presence filling the entire space, and his voice when he bellowed a greeting to his men in Gaelic was a deep, rumbling thunder. He was indeed uncivilized. He was magnificent. He did not walk through the house, he consumed it. He threw open doors with a crash, his heavy boots echoing on the marble floors. He touched everything, running a hand over the carved mantelpiece, testing the weight of a silver candlestick, his expression one of possessive curiosity. He was not a man who tiptoed through life. He strode through it and claimed it. There was no malice in his exploration, only a raw, almost boyish energy that was both terrifying and fascinating. I followed him from a distance, using the hidden ways of the house, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was the man who now owned my world, and he was everything my family was not: vibrant, powerful, and utterly unapologetically alive. Lachlan MacLeod was not a superstitious man. While his men whispered about the White Lady and left offerings of milk by the hearth, He just grunted and said the old house was drafty. But he was observant. He started noticing the things I thought I had so carefully concealed. A book on botany in the library, left open to a page on edible roots, when he knew he had been reading a history of Roman Britain the night before. The faint scent of lavender, the last of my mother's soap I had been rationing in a corridor he rarely used. A single long strand of pale blonde hair on the dark velvet of a chair in the music room. He never said anything to his men, but I saw the change in his eyes. The casual curiosity sharpened into a focused, intelligent watchfulness. He was no longer just occupying the house, he was hunting in it. The game of cat and mouse grew more intense. I had to be more careful, more clever. I learned his routines. He rose with the sun, spent his mornings with his estate manager, and his afternoons were often spent writing the lands. His evenings were for his books and his whiskey, usually taken in the library. The library became our silent battlefield. It was my favorite room, filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. A sanctuary from my loneliness. It seemed to be his as well. I would watch him from behind the tapestry in the map room, seeing him outlined by the firelight, a book in his huge hands, looking for all the world like a Viking chieftain who had somehow learned to read. He would occasionally look up, his gaze sweeping the darkened corners of the room, and I would hold my breath convinced he could see me, that his wild senses could somehow pierce my hiding place. One evening, my desperation outweighed my caution. My stomach was a tight, aching knot. The last of my preserved meats had run out, and I hadn't dared risk the kitchens for 2 days, because a sick housemaid had been confined to a cot near the pantry. I was dizzy with hunger. That night, Lachlan did something different. He had his cook prepare a tray, a small roasted chicken, a loaf of fresh bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and a pitcher of what looked like cider. But instead of having it brought to the dining hall, he had Dougal place it on a small table in the very center of the library. Then he dismissed everyone for the night, stoked the fire until it blazed, and settled into his large armchair, his back to the table, and opened his book. It was a trap, an obvious, blatant trap, and I knew it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to endure the hunger, but the smell of the roasted chicken wafted through the library, a siren song of warmth and sustenance. It was more than just food, it was a symbol of everything I had lost. Comfort, security, a hot meal on a cold night. The hunger was a physical pain, clouding my judgment. He's just one man, I thought, my reasoning frayed, and his back is turned. I am quiet, I can be in and out before he even knows. It was a foolish, desperate gamble. I waited for what felt like an eternity, until the rhythmic turning of pages from his side of the room became a steady, hypnotic sound. My body, acting on its own desperate accord, began to move. I slipped out from behind the tapestry, a wraith in gray. The floorboards, usually my allies, seemed to protest my every step with a near-silent groan. The firelight cast huge, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and hostile. I reached the table. My hands trembled as I reached for the loaf of bread. It was still warm. My fingers closed around it, and in that moment, a wave of such profound relief washed over me that I nearly wept. I tucked it into the pocket of my dress and reached for the chicken. My plan was to take a leg and flee, but just as my fingers brushed the crispy skin, a deep voice sliced through the silence. I would nay recommend the chicken. The cook's a bit heavy-handed with the salt. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid ball of terror. Slowly, I pulled my hand back and turned. Lachlan MacLeod had not moved from his chair. He was still facing the fire, the book still open in his lap. He hadn't even turned his head. He had spoken as if commenting on the weather. My mind raced, a frantic scramble for an escape that didn't exist. He knew, he had known all along. I find, he continued, his voice a low, calm rumble, that a house is much like a ship. You get to know its every creak and groan. You know when a line is out of place, when a sail isna set right. For weeks my sail hasna been set right. He finally closed his book with a soft thud and placed it on the floor beside his chair. Then he rose. He moved with a surprising deliberate grace for a man his size. He turned to face me, and the sheer scale of him was overwhelming. The firelight caught the red glints in his hair and beard, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were not angry. They were filled with a startling intensity, a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. "The Baintic Kernaban," he said, his lips twitching into what might have been a smile. "The White Lady of Blackwood. My men are terrified of you. They say you wail in the north wing." He took a step closer. You're a bit smaller than the legend suggests, and Udana seemed to be wailing. My voice, when I finally found it, was a dry, rasping whisper. Please, I meant no harm. I was just hungry. I ken that, he said, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. He gestured to the chair opposite his own. Sit, eat. You look as though a stiff breeze would carry you off. I stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't the reaction I had prepared for. I had expected shouting, accusations, being dragged out and handed over to the authorities as a common thief. But there was no threat in his posture, no anger in his voice. I was too exhausted, too hungry to argue or to run. Numbly, I did as he asked, sinking into the plush velvet of the armchair. He took the platter from the table, placed it on a stool between us, and then resumed his seat. He broke off a piece of bread and pushed it towards me. Eat, he repeated, his voice gentler this time. Hesitantly, I took the bread. The simple act of eating in front of someone, of accepting this kindness after months of furtive survival, was overwhelming. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on my cheek. I ate the bread with a ravenous desperation, trying not to show how starved I truly was. He watched me, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak again until I had devoured the bread and a leg of the chicken, the salty, savory taste and explosion on my tongue. Now, he said, leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees, why don't you tell me who you are and why you're haunting my house instead of living in it? The story came tumbling out, a disjointed, whispered confession fueled by exhaustion and the strange safety I felt in his presence. I told him everything, my father's weakness, Isolde's cruelty, Gideon's wastefulness. I told him about the debts, the flight in the night, the heartless note. I told him of my decision to stay, to hide, to become a ghost rather than face the shame of my family's ruin. I spoke of my mother, of my love for the house, of my fear that he, the barbarian Laird, would destroy it. I laid the whole pathetic story of my life at his feet, expecting scorn, or at the very least, a clinical sort of pity. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lachlan hadn't interrupted me once. He had listened with that same unnerving intensity, his gaze never leaving my face. He leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long time, stroking his thick beard in thought. Ashworth, he finally said, the name sounding like a stone in his mouth. I knew of Lord Ashworth's debts. I did not know he was the kind of man to sell his house with his daughter still inside it. There was a new hard edge to his voice, a dangerous glint in his eyes that had not been there before. It was not directed at me. Your family are cowards and fools. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with absolute conviction. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt seen. You are not a burden, he said, his voice dropping low again. You are a survivor. You have more courage in your wee finger than your father has in his entire body. To stay here, to fend for yourself in a cold, empty house, that is the act of a warrior, not a victim. I didn't know how to respond to such a statement. No one had ever called me courageous. I had always been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who endured. He then laid out a proposal that was so audacious, so utterly unexpected, that I could only stare at him in stunned silence. He did not want me to leave. He said the house felt more alive with me in it, even as a ghost, than it ever would empty. But he would not have me hiding in the walls like a rat. He offered me a bargain. I have the money and the power to hold this land, he said, leaning forward again, his eyes locking with mine. But I am a Highlander in a den of English vipers. I do not know their ways, their rules, their subtle poisons. They see me as an uncultured brute, a savage with a full purse. They will try to cheat me, to swindle me, to mock me behind their perfumed hands. You, he said, pointing a thick finger at me, you know this world. You were born in it. Teach me how to navigate it. Be my guide, my counsel in the ways of your people. In return, this house will be your home, truly your home. You will have a warm bed, food in your belly, and my protection. No one will ever harm you under my roof, not your family, not their creditors, no one. It was an insane proposition. The disgraced daughter of a ruined lord, tutoring a wild Scottish laird on the finer points of English society. It was the stuff of penny dreadfuls. But what was my alternative? To be cast out into a world where I had no name, no money, and no prospects? Here was a man offering me not charity, but a partnership. He wasn't saving a damsel in distress. He was hiring a consultant. He was giving me a purpose, a role beyond that of a specter. Why? I asked, my voice still weak. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. A flicker of something, a memory, a shadow of an old pain crossed his face. Let's just say I have a fondness for those who stand and fight when others run, he said. And I have no love for bullies, whether they be in a back alley or a ballroom. So do we have an accord, Miss Ashworth? He held out his hand. It was a huge, calloused hand, scarred and powerful, yet his gesture was one of respect. My own hand was thin and pale as I placed it in his. His grip was surprisingly gentle, his warmth seeping into my cold skin. We have an accord, Mr. McLeod, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. That night, for the first time in months, I slept in my own bed, between clean, warm sheets. Lachlan had instructed his housekeeper, a stern but kind-faced woman named Morag, to see to my needs. She had clucked her tongue at my threadbare dress and thin frame, but her eyes were not unkind. She drew me a hot bath, infused with herbs that smelled of the Highlands, and laid out a simple, warm nightgown. As I drifted off to sleep, the house seemed to settle around me, its groans now sounding like contented sighs. I was no longer its ghost, I was something new, and as I slept, I did not dream of the past, but of the strange, uncertain, and utterly electrifying future that had just begun. The next morning marked the beginning of my new life, and Lachlan's peculiar education. Our alliance, forged in the firelight of the library, now had to be put into practice. The first order of business was to explain my sudden appearance to his household. Lachlan handled it with a blunt efficiency that I would come to admire. He gathered his senior staff in the morning room, Dougal, Morag, and a few others, and simply announced, "This is Miss Alara Ashworth. Her family, the previous owners, are contemptible excuses for human beings who abandon her. She has been living here in secret. She is now under my protection, and will be treated as the lady of the house. You will show her every respect. Any questions?" There were none. His men and women were loyal to him, not to convention. If the Laird said a ghost was now the lady of the house, then she was. Morag simply nodded and asked me if I would prefer tea or coffee with my breakfast, and with that my existence was seamlessly woven into the fabric of Blackwood Manor. Our lessons began in earnest. My first task was to civilize the Laird, a challenge that felt akin to taming a Highland storm. We started with etiquette at the dinner table. "Why," he grumbled, staring at the formidable array of forks I had laid out, "would any sane man need 3 different pokers for one piece of fish?" "It is not about sanity, it is about signaling," I explained, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "The small fork is for the oysters, the next is for the fish course, the largest is for the main. Using the correct one shows you are a man of breeding and sophistication," he snorted, picking up the largest fork and using it to spear a potato. "I am a man with a bigger bloody castle than any of them. Is that not signal enough?" His stubborn pragmatism was both frustrating and endearing. I taught him which bows were appropriate for which level of nobility, how to handle a teacup without looking like he was about to crush it, and the art of the backhanded compliment, a staple of English aristocratic conversation. He, in turn, was a surprisingly quick study, his sharp mind cutting through the nonsense to grasp the underlying strategies. He saw society not as a set of rules, but as a battlefield with its own peculiar weapons. While I taught him the art of conversation, he taught me the art of survival. He was appalled by my physical frailty. "You're as pale as milk and as thin as a reed," he declared one afternoon, dragging me out into the crisp autumn air. "You need sun and strength." He took me to the old stables, where his men practiced with staffs and swords. To my horror, he put a wooden staff in my hands. "You will learn to defend yourself," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will protect you with my life, but your safety should never depend entirely on another person." The lessons were grueling. My muscles ached in ways I never knew possible, but under his patient, firm instruction, I began to change. The staff, at first heavy and awkward, began to feel like an extension of my arm. I learned to parry, to strike, to use an opponent's weight against them. The physical exertion brought color to my cheeks and a new light to my eyes. For the first time, I felt a sense of my own physical power. Lachlan would often partner with me, moving with a speed that belied his size, forcing me to anticipate, to react, to be present in my own body. There was an intimacy in these sessions, a dance of thrust and parry that brought us into close proximity, the air crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with combat. Our partnership was tested when Lord Pemberton, our closest and most odious neighbor, came to call. He was a preening popinjay who had been a close associate of my father's, and I knew he had been instrumental in some of the worst financial advice that led to our ruin. He arrived, unannounced, clearly intending to size up the new savage owner of Blackwood. Lachlan, fresh from the stables and dressed in his usual rugged attire, met him in the grand hall. I stood slightly behind him, a silent observer. "MacLeod," Pemberton said, his voice dripping with condescension as he surveyed Lachlan's attire. "An unexpected pleasure. I had heard rumors, of course. I felt it my duty to welcome you to the neighborhood and offer my guidance. Things are done a certain way here, you understand. I understand that you loaned Ashworth a great deal of money at an exorbitant rate and then advised him to invest it in a failing shipping line you happen to own." Lachlan replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Is that the certain way things are done here, Pemberton?" Pemberton's face went pale, then flushed a blotchy red. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "And who is this?" he asked, finally noticing me, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of recognition, before dismissing me as a servant. Before Lachlan could unleash the torrent of Highland fury I saw brewing in his eyes, I stepped forward. "Lord Pemberton," I said, my voice cool and even, "how lovely to see you again. I am Alara Ashworth. I am assisting Mr. MacLeod with the management of the estate." I gave him the smallest, most dismissive curtsy I had been taught, the kind reserved for a tradesman. The shock on his face was a masterpiece. He sputtered, trying to reconcile the ghost of the ruined Ashworth girl with the composed woman standing before him. He saw me not as a victim, but as an ally of the man who now held all the power. He had come to intimidate and instead found himself outmaneuvered. He made his excuses and fled, his dignity in tatters. After he was gone, Lachlan turned to me, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. It transformed his rugged features, making him look years younger. "Alara Ashworth," he boomed, his laughter echoing in the hall. "You didn't need a staff to defeat that one. You gutted him with a curtsy." He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his touch warm and solid. In that moment, we were not master and ward or teacher and student. We were partners, a team. As the weeks turned into months, the castle transformed. Under Lachlan's direction, and with my knowledge of its history, Blackwood began to shine again. He brought in craftsmen to repair the stonework, and I guided them on how to preserve the ancient carvings. He ordered new furniture, and I helped him select pieces that complemented the manor's character. His Highland culture began to blend with the English stone. The scent of peat smoke often mingled with the smell of beeswax and lemon oil. The sound of a lone piper practicing on the battlements became as familiar as the chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. The house was alive, a vibrant fusion of two worlds, just as we were. My feelings for Lachlan deepened into something I was afraid to name. I saw beyond the uncivilized exterior to the man beneath. I saw his fierce loyalty to his men, his sharp and surprisingly sophisticated mind, his quiet moments of contemplation by the fire. I saw the way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room, a silent question, a shared joke. One evening, I found him in the gallery, standing before a portrait of my mother. It was the only one that hadn't been sold off, as it was considered a permanent part of the house's decoration. "She was beautiful," he said, not turning as I approached. "You have her eyes. She loved this house," I said softly. "She would be glad to see it so full of life again." "A house is just stone and wood, without people," he said, turning to face me. The light from the sconces cast his face in shadow, but his eyes were bright. "You are the heart of this house, Alara. You always have been." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against my skin. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my soul. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the magnetic pull that had been growing between us for months. He leaned in slightly, and my breath caught in my throat. But then he seemed to catch himself, dropping his hand and taking a small step back, the moment broken. A flicker of uncertainty, something I had never seen in him before, crossed his face before he masked it with a gruff cough and changed the subject. The space between us remained, charged and shimmering. The news from the outside world came in fragments. I learned from village gossip, carefully relayed by Morag, that my family's flight had not gone unnoticed. Their creditors were furious, and their names were mud throughout the county. Then a letter arrived, forwarded from a solicitor in London. It was addressed to Lachlan, but the wax seal bore the Ashworth crest. He brought it to me in the library, his expression grim. "It's from your father," he said. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had thought I was free of them. The letter was an oily, sycophantic missive. My father wrote of their unfortunate circumstances and their deep concern for my welfare. He had heard that Mr. MacLeod, a man of great standing and fortune, had purchased Blackwood. He proposed that, as my legal guardian, a blatant lie, as I was of age, he should come to Blackwood to discuss a proper arrangement for my upkeep, an arrangement that would undoubtedly involve a hefty allowance for him and his family. It was a thinly veiled attempt at extortion. "He thinks he can sell you to me twice," Lachlan growled, crumbling the letter in his fist. "The man has no shame." "They know you have money now," I said, a cold dread seeping into me. "They won't stop." "Let them come," Lachlan said, his eyes like chips of granite. "Let's see how brave they are when they're not just leaving a note for a defenseless girl." His words were prophetic. A few weeks later, we received word that my family had returned to England. They had taken rooms at a nearby inn, their funds apparently exhausted, and they were spreading a story that their beloved daughter, Alara, was being held against her will by the savage Scottish Laird who had stolen their home. They were painting themselves as concerned parents, desperate to rescue their child. The stage was being set for a confrontation. Lachlan decided we would meet them on our own terms. He was planning a grand ball, a formal introduction to the local gentry, to solidify his position as the new master of Blackwood. "We will invite them," he declared, his jaw set. "We will let them walk into the lion's den, and you, Alara, will not be a ghost hiding in the walls. You will be the lady of the manor, standing by my side. We will show them all what a savage and a burden can do together." The prospect was terrifying, to face them again, to face their lies and manipulations in public. But looking at Lachlan, at the unwavering belief in his eyes, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I would not be a ghost, I would not be a victim, I would be the warrior he saw in me. The ball was set, the invitations sent, and the battle lines were drawn. Blackwood Manor was about to witness a showdown, not with swords and staffs, but with whispers, lies, and the devastating power of the truth. The night of the ball arrived cloaked in a velvet darkness, the stars sharp and cold in the winter sky. Blackwood Manor blazed with light, a beacon of warmth and defiance against the night. Carriages crunched up the gravel drive, depositing the cream of the county's society onto the grand stone steps. From my place at the top of the staircase, standing beside Lachlan, I watched them arrive. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but for the first time in my life, I felt I belonged. Marag had helped me with my gown, a deep emerald silk that Lachlan had ordered for me from London. It was simple but elegant, and it made my eyes shine and brought out the faint color in my cheeks. My hair was swept up, adorned with a simple string of pearls, a gift from Lachlan, left on my vanity that morning with a simple note that read, "For the lady of the house." Lachlan himself was a revelation. He wore a formal Highland dress, his clan's tartan draped over one broad shoulder, fastened with a silver brooch that glittered in the candlelight. The rugged Laird was gone, replaced by a chieftain in his full magnificent glory. He looked powerful, elemental, and utterly at home in the hall of my ancestors. As he stood beside me, his sheer presence was a fortress, and I drew strength from it. He caught my eye and gave me a small, reassuring nod. "Ready for battle, Moquaid?" he murmured, his use of the Gaelic endearment, my heart sending a warm shiver through me. I nodded back, my hand resting lightly on his arm. "Ready." Our guests were a mixture of the curious, the sycophantic, and the openly disdainful. Lord Pemberton was there, his expression sour, unable to resist the social gravity of the event. They swirled around us, a sea of silks and velvets, their greetings a mixture of feigned politeness and poorly concealed assessment. Lachlan handled them with a surprising grace, his lessons with me having paid off. He was charming when he needed to be, intimidating when necessary, and he deflected their subtle barbs with a blunt humor that left them disarmed. I played my part, the serene and knowledgeable hostess, my intimate understanding of the house and its history, giving me an authority they could not challenge. Then they arrived, my family. Their entrance caused a ripple in the crowd, a sudden drop in the conversational hum. They had clearly spent their last few shillings on their attire, attempting to project an image of their former status. My father looked smaller, diminished, his face puffy, and his eyes evasive. Gideon was sullen, his usual swagger replaced by a resentful slouch. But Isolde, my stepmother, was in her element. She swept into the hall as if she still owned it, her face a mask of tragic concern, a predator playing the part of a martyr. They made their way directly towards us, the crowd parting before them, like the Red Sea. Isolde's eyes, cold and hard as agates, fixed on me. She ignored Lachlan completely, her focus entirely on her performance. "Alara, my darling girl," she cried, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. She reached for me, her hands outstretched as if to embrace her long-lost child. I instinctively took a step back, closer to the solid warmth of Lachlan's side. "We were so worried," she continued, her voice trembling with false emotion. "When we heard you were here with this man, we came as soon as we could to take you home. You poor, confused child." The narrative was clear. I was the helpless victim. Lachlan the brutish captor. It was a play for the audience, an attempt to publicly shame Lachlan and reassert their parental authority over me. Before Lachlan could speak, before the thunder I saw gathering in his expression could break, I found my voice. It was clear and steady, amplified by the hall's acoustics. "Home?" I asked, a single word that cut through her performance. "What home would that be, Isolde? The one you fled from in the middle of the night? The one you left me in with nothing but a note telling me I was a burden?" A collective gasp went through the room. Isolde's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the raw fury beneath. "You are overwrought, child," she snapped, recovering quickly. "This brute has clearly twisted your mind. We are your family. We love you." Love? The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I took a step forward, away from the safety of Lachlan's side, feeling a strange cold power flowing through me. This was my stage now. Let me tell you all about the Ashworth family's love. I turned my gaze from her, addressing the rapt audience of aristocrats. Their love is leaving a daughter to fend for herself in a cold, empty house while they run from their debts. Their love is a lifetime of being told you are second best, an inconvenience, a ghost in your own home. Their love is trying to use that same daughter as a pawn to extort money from the very man who showed her more kindness in a single evening than they did in 2 decades. My words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. My father had the decency to look ashamed, his gaze fixed on his shoes. Gideon just scowled, but Isolde was not so easily defeated. "Lies," she shrieked, her voice losing its cultured tone and becoming shrill. "She is hysterical. She has always been a difficult, ungrateful girl. We did what we had to for her own good. For her own good." It was Lachlan who spoke now, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. He stepped forward, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "You call abandonment for her own good. You left her to starve. If it were not for her own courage and resourcefulness, a courage you could never comprehend, God knows what would have become of her." He then fixed his gaze on my father. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "I received your letter. You wish to discuss an arrangement for your daughter's upkeep. Very well, let us discuss it. I will provide for Alara for the rest of her life. She will want for nothing. She will have safety, warmth, and respect. She will be the mistress of this house, her house. And in return," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "you and your family will never set foot on this property again. You will never speak to her, write to her, or so much as speak her name. That is my arrangement. Do you find it acceptable?" It was a public, absolute disownment, not by him of them, but by him on my behalf. It severed the final tie, cauterized the wound in front of the whole world. Gideon, however, had inherited his mother's arrogance and none of her cunning. His face was purple with rage. "You have no right," he snarled, taking a lurching step towards me. "She is our sister. She will come with us." He reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. It happened in a heartbeat. Before I could even react with the defensive moves Lachlan had taught me, he moved. He was a blur of tartan and fury. He seized Gideon's wrist with one hand, his grip like iron. Gideon cried out in pain, his fingers instantly going numb and releasing my arm. With his other hand, Lachlan grabbed the front of Gideon's jacket, lifted him a clear 6 inches off the floor, and propelled him backwards. My stepbrother stumbled and crashed into a table of champagne flutes, which went down with a spectacular shatter of glass and spreading liquid. He lay there, dazed and humiliated, amidst the wreckage. The hall was utterly silent, save for Gideon's pathetic moans. Lachlan stood over him, a terrifying figure of righteous anger. "Do not," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room, "ever lay a hand on her again." He then turned to the rest of the shocked assembly. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his composure returning as quickly as his temper had flared. "The trash has been taken out. Please enjoy the party." He turned his back on my sputtering, defeated family, and with a gentle hand on the small of my back, he guided me away from the scene, leaving them to the scornful stares and whispered judgments of the entire county. We had not just won, we had annihilated them. As the music hesitantly started up again, I looked up at Lachlan, at this fierce, protective, honorable man, and I knew with a certainty that filled every part of me that I was finally, truly home. The rest of the ball passed in a blur of surreal triumph. My family, now social lepers, were escorted out by a grim-faced Dougal, their departure marked by the titters and contemptuous glances of the other guests. Lord Pemberton and his ilk, who had been waiting for the barbarian Laird to fail, now looked at him with a new healthy dose of fear and respect. They swarmed him, not with condescension, but with fawning admiration. They saw power, and they bowed to it. But Lachlan had little time for them. His attention was entirely on me. He guided me to the far end of the ballroom, to the tall French doors that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens. The cold night air was a balm on my heated cheeks. The sounds of the party faded to a muted hum behind us, the music a soft, distant melody. The silence between us was no longer charged with unspoken tension, but with the profound, peaceful exhaustion that follows a great battle won. I leaned against the cold stone balustrade, my trembling finally subsiding. "Are you all right, Alara?" Lachlan asked, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He stood beside me, not touching, but his presence was a warm protective shield against the chill of the night. "I am more than all right," I said, turning to look up at him. The moonlight softened the harsh lines of his face, illuminating the genuine concern in his stormy eyes. "I feel as though I've held my breath my entire life, and I've only just now been able to exhale." I gave him a small, watery smile. "Thank you, Lachlan, for everything. You didn't just give me a home, you gave me a voice." "You always had a voice," he corrected gently. "You just needed someone to finally listen." He moved a step closer, the space between us shrinking. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, and this time he didn't pull away. "What I said in there about you being the mistress of this house, I meant it. In every sense of the word, if you'll have me." My heart, which had been racing with adrenaline, now began to pound with a different, more powerful emotion. "If I'll have you?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Lachlan, I." The words caught in my throat. All my life I had been taught to be reserved, to conceal my feelings, but with him there was no need for artifice. "You are the heart of this house, Alara." He repeated his words from the portrait gallery, "and you have become the heart of my life." When I bought this place, I was buying stone and land. I was finding a treasure far greater. He looked down at me, his gaze so full of raw, honest emotion that it took my breath away. "I love you, Mokradai. I think I have from the moment I found a fierce, starving ghost defying me in my own library." Tears I hadn't shed in my darkest moments of solitude now welled in my eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. "I love you too, Lachlan MacLeod," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I think I have from the moment I saw a barbarian stride into this hall and fill it with life again." That was all the invitation he needed. He lowered his head and his lips met mine. The kiss was not rough or demanding, but it was full of all the power and passion that defined him. It was a kiss of promises kept and battles won, of two solitudes finding a home in each other. It was fire and whiskey, and the wild windswept highlands, and it was the solid, steadfast comfort of a hearth on a cold night. When we finally broke apart, we rested our foreheads together, our breath mingling in the frosty air. The future was no longer an uncertain, terrifying void. It was here, solid and real, in his arms. The next morning I awoke to a new world. Sunlight streamed through my window, and for the first time it didn't feel like an intrusion. I walked through the halls of Blackwood Manor, not as a specter or a guest, but as its true mistress. The staff who had witnessed the public drama of the previous night greeted me with smiles and nods of genuine respect. Morag presented me with a set of household keys on a heavy iron ring. "These belong to you now, my lady," she said, her usual stern expression softened by a warm smile. The weight of the keys in my hand was the weight of responsibility, of belonging. We heard news of my family a few days later. Dougal, whose network of information was vast and efficient, reported that they had fled the area in the dead of night, utterly disgraced. The story of their public humiliation had spread like wildfire. No inn would offer them credit, no respectable family would receive them. Their creditors, who had heard of their failed attempt to attach themselves to Lachlan's fortune, were now pursuing them with renewed vigor. They had truly been cast out, forced to live the life of vagrants they had so carelessly sentenced me to. I felt a brief sharp pang of something, not pity, but a sad final acknowledgement of the family I once wished I'd had. Then I let it go. Their fate was of their own making. My future lay here, at Blackwood. Lachlan and I were building something new, a family defined not by blood but by loyalty, respect, and a love as strong and enduring as the ancient stones of the manor itself. 1 year later, the transformation was complete. Blackwood Manor was no longer just an English estate. It was a vibrant blend of two cultures, a testament to the union of its master and mistress. The gardens bloomed with a mix of classic English roses and hardy Scottish heather. The sound of Gaelic conversation was as common in the halls as the king's English. Lachlan had not been tamed, nor had I been made wild. Instead, we had met in the middle, creating a life that was uniquely ours. He was now a respected, if still somewhat intimidating, figure in the county. His blunt honesty and sharp business sense had won over many, and those he hadn't won, he had simply bought out. I was no longer the pale, timid girl who hid in the shadows. I was confident, my voice steady, my laughter frequent. I managed the estate with a capable hand, my love for the house now expressed in active stewardship rather than secret preservation. I still spent my afternoons in the library, but now Lachlan was there with me, his large frame folded into his favorite armchair, our comfortable silence a conversation in itself. We had faced down gossip and disapproval, navigated the treacherous waters of local politics, and weathered every storm together. Our alliance had deepened into a partnership that was the envy of all who knew us. One crisp autumn evening, we stood on that same terrace where he had first declared his love. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Lachlan wrapped his arms around me from behind, pulling me back against his solid chest. We watched as the lights of the manor flickered on, one by one, a warm and welcoming glow against the deepening twilight. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "Miss what?" I asked, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the quiet," he clarified with a soft chuckle. "Before me and my loud, uncivilized clansmen invaded your sanctuary." I turned in his arms to face him, placing my hands on his chest. "You didn't invade my sanctuary, Lachlan. You liberated me from my prison." I looked up into his face, at the man who had seen a warrior where everyone else saw a victim, who had seen a treasure where his own family saw a burden. This house was just a beautiful, empty shell. You filled it with life. You filled my life with love. I will never be quiet again. He smiled, that slow, wonderful smile that always made my heart skip a beat, and lowered his head to kiss me. And in that kiss, I felt the truth of it all. Being abandoned by my family felt like the end of the world, but it was not. It was the beginning of my life. It was the catalyst that led me to this man, to this love, to this incredible, vibrant life I never would have known existed had I not first been forced to become a ghost. Sometimes the worst thing that can ever happen to you is the very thing that sets you free. I hope my story can be a reminder that your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Sometimes our greatest strength is forged in the fires of betrayal, and the family we build for ourselves is the one that truly defines us. Thank you for listening to my journey today. I'd love to read your own stories in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated, only to find a strength you never knew you possessed? Your stories inspire me and everyone else in this community, so please don't hesitate to share. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and finding your own path. Thank you again for joining me. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood, and I wish you all the strength to build the life you deserve.